You're listening to Indications by the Conference Board.
Welcome to the Conference Board's Indications podcast. Indications is a public podcast featuring our global roster of thought leaders. Topics range from economic growth and competitiveness to human capital, governance, sustainability, and beyond. Each episode is a serious conversation grounded in data and insights that will keep you ahead of the curve in a turbulent world. I'm here with a very special guest, Mr. Jay Walsh, to discuss the future of global supply chains, Part 1. Jay Walsh is a partner at Ernst & Young, where he leads the life sciences supply chain practice and serves as the America's lead for the cross-industry manufacturing practice. Jay specializes in global supply chain, manufacturing, and R&D operations, and has significant experience reducing costs and improving margins for clients across industries, including pharmaceutical, biotech, consumer goods, telecom, and others. Jay holds a bachelor's in science and management and engineering from the University of Vermont. Welcome, Jay. It's a pleasure to meet you.
Thanks, Dana. Happy to be here.
So, Jay, let's begin our conversation. During the pandemic, a topic that only inventory managers fretted over became a breakfast table conversation, and that topic is supply chains. Tell us, why are supply chains a huge topic now, and why should businesses care about them?
Absolutely. So the disruption caused by the pandemic has really challenged supply chains globally across industries and sectors, and the pain points that those have caused are really being felt by executives and consumers alike. At the onset of the pandemic, we started to see issues with closed borders and shelter-in-place orders, and that's been followed on by labor shortages in manufacturing and causing problems with ports and trucking. So it really has been an ongoing challenge for folks over the last 2 years. And add to that changes in consumer behavior. So we're seeing quite a lot of consumers moving from services to products in terms of what they're purchasing these days, and that's only exacerbated some of the challenges in the supply chain. Within the life sciences space, we've seen a couple different scenarios play out. Within the pharmaceutical area, we've actually weathered the pandemic better than most and have had a number of successes in terms of delivering vaccines and the like, and the supply chains have held up reasonably well due to inventory levels and some of the internally controlled capabilities of the supply chains that pharmaceutical companies have. On the flip side, medical device and some of our generics producers have had more challenges. You've probably heard of challenges with the N95 mask situation, commodities such as that, where we've had real issues due to single sourcing from certain regions. And the microchips issue that we're having is really impacting some of our medical device manufacturing. So there has been sort of a mixed bag in terms of what we've seen in the life sciences area. Even pre-COVID, though, there was a push to make the U.S. less dependent on foreign production of pharmaceutical ingredients and medical device components, and that's only being, I think, further accelerated based on some of the things that have happened over the last 2 years. And I think the important thing that people recognize is that this is not just about business processes and the profits of firms and how successful they are, but really it's about protecting consumers and having resilient supply chains that allow us to secure the health and well-being of people all over the world.
So how have supply chains evolved over the last 40 years? I mean, because certainly they're nothing new.
Yeah, so it's interesting. Even within the last 40 years, we just started using the term supply chain about 35 years ago. Before that, it was really, you were either a manufacturing person or a distribution person or a procurement person, but supply chain and the concept of a connected supply chain is actually relatively new. Once we sort of embraced that concept, though, we've seen significant improvements over the last 40 years. Things around efficiency. So certainly we've gotten to be much more efficient in our supply chains and address the demand for lower costs of goods. Globalization has been a huge part of the evolution in supply chains. So it's not only serving a global marketplace, but also producing products in a global manner and taking advantages of the different capabilities that regions have to offer. I would say that digital is one of the latest areas of evolution. We're seeing quite a lot of embrace in the digital space. Things that we were talking about even 4 or 5 years ago are now very much reality around the industrial Internet of Things, machine learning and AI, predictive capabilities and the like. Really exciting stuff. And then certainly what we're seeing with the pandemic is the topic of resilience and how do we make our supply chains much more resilient. So those are some of the things that I think we've seen very clearly.
So how do firms juggle just in time, which has really made supply chains efficient, with resiliency?
So great question. And I would say that Just in time focuses on the elimination of waste, right? That's basically the premise. And that's led to quite a lot of improvements in cost and quality. And it's been hugely successful over the years. Many of the lean concepts that companies are still embracing today find their origins back to the JIT or just-in-time concepts from the 80s and 90s. So just-in-time is a good thing. One of the things, though, that just-in-time considers waste is inventory. And reducing inventories can always cause problems if you've got issues with your supply chain. So as inventories went down and supply chains got more complex and global and faster over time, the margin for error really decreased. So this need to sort of balance just-in-time with resiliency has come to the fore, especially in the last couple of years. So I would say that supply chains are capable of handling small disruptions. They happen every day. But when something as big and unforeseen and pervasive as COVID hits, that's going to cause problems, and inventory is one of those potential challenges. This is causing companies to really incorporate resiliency into their supply chains in a much bigger way than they did just 2 years ago. And that's something that we're working with companies to strike their appropriate balance every day.
Well, a huge component or source for supply chains is China. Is it feasible for firms to diversify away from China?
I think the question to me is much more about diversification in general and not just thinking about any one country. All markets have strengths and weaknesses in what they can do or contribute to the supply chain. And these need to be understood in the context of cost and quality and agility and resilience for our companies that are operating supply chains today. So I think, re-examining supply chain strategies, including diversification, is something that all companies should be doing right now. And alternate sources of supply are more important than ever. But I think it's a much more broad topic around all the regions that companies operate in.
So, where are these next regions for locating supply chains?
Well, I think you'll see examples of localization and regionalization in most areas, including Asia Pacific and EMEA. Those will be two certainly key ones. And this localization or regionalization, as we often refer to it, is being driven by a couple things. One is new government regulatory requirements. So as governments respond to the pandemic and other geopolitical situations around the world, they're going to drive additional requirements and regulations that companies are going to have to respond to. And if that includes more regionalization of supply, that will happen. I think the other thing that is going to drive that, the second thing, is really specific sourcing issues. So points in the supply chain that didn't have adequate sources of supply over the past 2 years have really become obvious, right? So we need to make sure that we're looking at alternate sources of supply, and that may be local or regional sources. So that's something that I think we'll see. I do believe that from a manufacturing perspective, you may see some manufacturing movement, but the building of new manufacturing facilities, particularly in life sciences, is a very expensive and a long lead time activity. So for regions that require sort of that manufacturing localization, I think you're probably more likely to see more contract manufacturing use than building brand new sites.
Enjoying this podcast on supply chains from the Conference Board? You can discover even more on our website and at our upcoming virtual event, Responsible and Resilient Supply Chain Management. This virtual conference on April 21st will feature some of the world's top supply chain executives to discuss what has become a global crisis. We will examine the recent product shortages and potentially long-lasting effects on businesses, while looking at proven strategies in responsible sourcing and building a more resilient global supply chain. Can't make this event? Visit www.conference-board.org to access it on demand, along with other resources on global trade and value chains, including our popular 5 trends on the future of global supply chains. And now, back to our Indications podcast with Chief Economist Dana Peterson.
So what can firms do to ensure that they balance the needs of customers who want full shelves and don't want to have to wait months for product with aims to protect profit margins? Certainly there's a ton of savings from globalized supply chains.
Well, that's spot on. And the globalization of supply chain has helped not only with cost, but the diversity of what people can get it and find at the shelves, and also the speed at which they get product, right? So that's been very important and something that folks have really come to be accustomed to, right? I think interestingly enough, supply chain efficiency and resiliency aren't always at odds. We tend to think of it as being one or the other. But I think as companies sort of re-examine their supply chain networks, that can lead to both better resiliency and improved efficiency, actually. Nearly all companies should be doing this right now, really looking at their supply chain networks and how they're operating. And I think they'll find areas to not only improve resiliency, but also when you do that, you're going to find areas to improve efficiency. I think the other thing that will play into that is some of the implications of global tax. Lots of things in the news about how tax laws are changing around the globe, and that will also drive companies to potentially drive new efficiencies by looking at their supply chain networks. The other thing I would say there is, updated inventory strategies are going to be very important. We talked a little bit about that earlier, and while inventory in general is a cost, I think if you look at intentional inventory buffers, you're going to identify where you need inventory for resiliency reasons and where you don't. And where you don't, there's opportunities to reduce that and actually be more cost effective. I think a couple other things I would just touch upon is the use of analytics for better forecasting and of demand and predicting supply chain problems. We're seeing lots of use of machine learning and artificial intelligence to drive better forecasting. And those analytics allow us to more proactively identify weather issues or transportation problems or labor or geopolitical issues and be much more, proactive as opposed to reactive in how we deal with those. And then I would say that looking at new sourcing strategies can bring some additional vendors into a company's supply chain ecosphere. And that not only drives better resiliency in terms of having alternate sources of supply, but can also bring new innovations and reduce costs perhaps. So not always a bad thing to be looking at both those.
So these are all great ways that firms can kind of alter their business models to adjust to current supply chain disruptions. You also mentioned technology. What about automation and blockchain? I mean, are those also factored in with using AI in terms of better supporting supply chains?
Absolutely. That's really the name of the game these days is how to companies take advantage of a lot of the digital capabilities to improve their supply chain performance and their resiliency. We're seeing a lot of emerging technologies taking place today, and that's driving improved reliability, improved quality, and reduced cost, right? So lots of good reasons to be doing that. And the cost of that is coming down significantly, right? Even just a few years ago, the cost of some of these technologies was, I would say, prohibitive sometimes. But now it's getting much more reasonable and really giving a lot of companies a chance to do that. So things like industrial Internet of Things. So that's where companies are using sensors and such on their equipment to identify potential problems before they happen, which is fantastic. You mentioned AI and machine learning, Dana. We're seeing that used to drive all kinds of interesting analytics to drive predictions around forecasting as well as supply capabilities. AR, VR, so augmented or virtual reality. This is something that it went from sort of gaming, right? We had folks who were using this for video games to now we have folks who are using this on production shop floors to repair equipment and do training and things like that in a much more efficient and safe manner. And then blockchain is one that is quite a lot of buzz around blockchain these days, and it's actually starting to be quite impactful for businesses, especially as we think about some of the emerging therapies like cell and gene therapy, where you're going to require very different supply chain operating models, and blockchain is going to be a big part of it. And then I guess the only thing I would add to as a final note is you can't talk about all that good digital stuff without talking about cybersecurity. And we see a lot of folks paying attention to cyber these days. It's a daily challenge for companies to be vigilant in that space. And as you get more technology into your supply chain, you got to make sure you're bringing along more cybersecurity as well.
So you've made it clear that all of this is not just something that the supply chain manager needs to pay attention to. So what is the role of the C-suite, the folks at the very top of the organization, in ensuring that firms have resilient but also productive supply chains?
Yeah, so this is a pretty easy one in my mind, Dana. I think the C-suite really needs to put supply chain resiliency on their agenda, right? And it can't be numbered like 45. It's got to be up near the top in terms of what they're addressing, not only now, but on an ongoing basis, right? This is something that's going to continue to be important. And with that, I think they've got to provide the right resources, whether that's people or working capital or technology to address some of the sources of supply chain risk.
Absolutely. So what are some of the factors firms can consider regarding supporting their goods and services supply chains? I guess anything you already haven't mentioned.
Well, I would say that there's some, in addition to some of those strategic things that we talked about, Dana, around looking at your supply chain operating model and your network where you have your facilities and the like, there's some very tactical things too that firms need to be looking at. And that's just doing good risk assessments and good risk management for their supply chains. So looking at what are the risks and drivers within their supply chains, identifying and addressing some of those major deficiencies, updating contingency plans and making sure there's clear lines of responsibility for when something happens, who's going to make the decision to do something differently. And then you can conduct simulations today to even get the organizations more familiar with those plans and how to respond. So those, I think, are some very tactical things. And the only other one I would add is exploring public-private partnerships as supply chains continue to get more complex and the like. Looking at public-private partnerships is one way to drive not only better outcomes for consumers, but also potential backup scenarios by those types of partnerships.
Thank you. And you mentioned at the top of the call pharmaceuticals. And life sciences, what are some of the unique challenges that the pharmaceutical industry is facing regarding supply chains? Again, things you already haven't mentioned. And are firms ready for the next health crisis?
Yeah, a good question. And life sciences is really, it's not a homogeneous industry, right? You've got innovative pharmaceutical companies that have different models than generics companies, than medical device companies. But I would say that there's some common themes in addition to the things that we've talked about so far. One of those is supply chain operating models and looking at new ways or new required supply chains to support new therapies. I mentioned cell and gene therapy. That's a very different supply chain than what we do today with traditional medicines. Aging workforce. This is something that's common across many industries, and pharma is no exception, right? We've got an aging workforce in our facilities, and how do we attract new, younger workers and get them excited about working in this industry, right? And one of the ways we do that is with digital, right? Having a worker come to his pharmaceutical site and have to put his iPhone or his, all his technology aside while he goes on the shop floor is not a way to, attract new, younger folks. So we got to make it appealing and make sure that we're using that technology effectively and using it for our workforce. And then I think the other area that's going to continue in addition to digital is the focus on cost, right? That's going to, despite the challenges we're having with resiliency, cost is going to continue to be a source of pressure from governments and consumers, right? So that's an area that we'll have to continue to address.
Well, Jay, this has been a fantastic conversation. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Dana. I've really enjoyed our discussion. And I would just say there's lots of lessons that we're learning about supply chain resiliency and the importance of supply chains going forward. And I'm very optimistic that we'll be in a better position coming out of this than we were going in, and we'll have good supply chains forever.
Thanks, Jay, again. Well, folks, this has been Indications from the Conference Board. If you enjoyed this podcast, you may listen to additional The Conference Board offerings by going to www.conference-board.org/podcast, or find us wherever you listen to podcasts. Thanks again for listening.
This has been Indications from the Conference Board.